having this conversation. So welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Sheena Mason with Free Your Mind, and I'm here today with a very special guest who I'm excited to talk about all things racelessness and all things race abolitionism. Her name is Shayla. Shayla, I want to pass the mic to you. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, and thank you for having me. I am Shayla Dube, and I always struggle to introduce myself. It's always which parts of me do I talk about and which ones do I leave? I'm in Canada. I am from Zimbabwe. I was born and raised in Zimbabwe, and I've been a settler in Canada for 18 years, since 2004. I am a social worker. I have a bachelor's and master's in social work, and I have been practicing in social work for 12 years. I primarily work with children, adults, and their families in my 9 to 5. And in my private practice, I work with the specific groups, particularly racialized people, specializing on all things racial trauma, all things race, and other areas that we consider to be culturally responsive and all that. So in a nutshell, that's me. I can answer to specific questions, but in a nutshell, that's me. I'm a mother of 3. It's an identity that I like to talk about the most. It's the reason I do what I do.
Thank you so much, Shayla. Yeah, I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you today because you already know we have a lot to discuss. I think sometimes it's almost easy to miss the complexity of what we're actually advocating for and why we're advocating for it. So I'm hoping to do a deep dive into your ideas as it pertains to the concept of race. Any experiences you have in embracing or recognizing your racelessness? Was there ever a time where you did racialize yourself and that sort of thing? Just share a bit about your personal journey as it pertains to that.
Right. Okay. As I've already shared that I came to Canada in 2004. So in the first 20 years of my life, my identity centered around me being a Zimbabwean, the language that I speak, and the tribe that I am, which is Ndebele. There's 16 languages are spoken in Zimbabwe, and I speak just one of them. And English was the official language, sadly. And I say sadly because from a colonial perspective, we know that people's indigenous languages were somewhat swallowed by colonialism. So I want to specify why I say sadly. So race was never really a thing. I may have experienced some of what I have come to now understand to be racism to some degree. I worked for a company that was predominantly that had people that were European for the most part, and I was the only local person. And I may have had my experiences and I didn't have the language, I guess. But from my day-to-day basis, racism or race was really not something that I struggled with. And I also, I didn't go around worrying about how I looked like. I didn't racialize myself. I didn't call myself Black to be specific. So fast forward to 2004, I came to Canada. I started studying social work. I started studying just within 1 year of being in Canada. And I find out that I'm supposedly Black. I'm not only just Black, I'm a person of color, and I'm a visible minority, and all that, all those fancy terms that
Oh no, she must have gotten kicked out. So I'm going to sit tight and wait for her to rejoin. Here she is. I was diligently writing down a question.
Oh my gosh.
Hi, Shayla. Welcome back.
I apologize. I was trying to reject a call and I may have accepted it by mistake.
Oh, no worries at all. No worries. Yeah, so you're talking about how when you transitioned from Zimbabwe to Canada, you started to learn that you were Black and a person of color and that sort of thing.
Right. So I consider those imposed identities because I do not recall ever being comfortable being put in those boxes. You asked me if there was a time that I racialized myself. I remember questioning in my professor in those classes, saying, "Why people of color? Doesn't everybody else have color?" And I don't think my professor knew how to handle me or how to answer those questions. So I quickly learned that if I wanted to pass those courses, I just needed to somehow conform. I do think that we conform to survive. So I learned that, yeah, there are people of color being called Black and being called white is normalized in this part of the world. So did I conform? Perhaps to some degree and subconsciously. And I want to say, I think as part of assimilating into the Canadian society, I may have, but I don't consider it as a voluntary thing that I did, that I was comfortable at some point to say, hey, I'm Shayla, I'm Black. I don't think so. So over the years, you learn that this is how this part of the world operates, because even in the forums where you're coming into university, you're expected to tick a box that says how you identify. And I don't think there's some flexibility there to say, hey, I'm just human. I'm just a human from Zimbabwe. So yeah. So I learned that this is just the way it is in this part of the world. And because I had this connection of who I am, I knew my roots, and I did not identify that way. I feel that to some degree, I can't say always, for the most part, I did resist. I think my discourse of resistance showed in how I wrote my essays. I even wrote my thesis for my master's about racialization of Black males. And even my Black has always been in quotation marks, because it's just not who I am. It is an imposed identity. I feel like I'm repeating myself now. So yeah, I may have, I look at it as sometimes we do conform to survive, really, because everybody else is going to call you Black, and I'm not going to argue with everybody to say, hey, that's not me. So to some degree, you just go with the flow. But deep down, if you know who you are, that really doesn't change. You remain who you are, and you identify yourself the way that you do. So I look at myself as I have that advantage of knowing who I am. So you can't just convince a 21-year-old that, hey, you're suddenly Black. You are a person of color. You are a visible minority, whatever that means. I think all these terms, they have their purpose. They may have good intentions about what they are for, but I see them as part of the problem. They perpetuate the same things that we are trying to challenge or dismantle. So those are my views about Blackness and whiteness. I say to myself that if I show up here and I say, hey, I'm Shayla, I'm Black, I see that as I am reducing myself to a juxtaposition to whiteness. And it's as if I'm invented by white people. And even the white people, it's in my quotes, it's just because I'm speaking. If I was writing, I will put it in my quote. It's like I was invented by Europeans. And not only was I invented by them, I was discovered by them, because that's how race was birthed. So I see that part of the problem, and therefore I may have conformed to some degree, but I'm at a point in my life where I see, we say that it takes a village to raise a child. So we are the village. We have young people that are born who are looking to us for their identities. They see the world through the lenses that we feed them. So if we don't have these conversations, we have a 3-year-old. I think I shared that I have children. So at some point, my 3-year-old came and asked me, Mom, why are my friends calling me Black? And she said, I look in the mirror and I don't see that I'm Black. I owe that 3-year-old an answer that she understands. I'm not going to say, go ahead, call yourself Black. So I had to answer that question to my 3-year-old and say, why I have friends calling her Black. And so that's why these conversations are important, because we have people like my 3-year-old child then, she's 7 now, and she still does not racialize herself, because that's not the education that I'm giving her. That's not the knowledge that I'm passing on to her to racialize herself. I'm teaching her that she can identify herself the way that makes sense to her. And if she looks in the mirror and she doesn't see Black, I'm not going to normalize that to her. And go
Shayla,
ahead.
Do you remember what you told your 3-year-old when she asked?
Yeah, I do. My first question was really asking her, when you look in the mirror, what do you see? And she said, I'm brown, Mommy. And I said, okay. So, and I said to her, so if you are brown, what matters is how you see yourself and how you identify yourself. But then I went on to explain to her that people are not colors. So she got the concept for a 3-year-old that people are not Black and white. And she tells me, and she was able to look at things that are white and show me that, Mom, this is white. None of my friends look like this. So why do we call them white? And the one example that I said to her, I said, if I call you a cow, will you start mooing? And she cracked up laughing and she says, no, I wouldn't. So, and then I said, that goes the same for what your friends call you. So if your friends call you Black and you don't see yourself as Black, what matters is what you call yourself. And that's what she has ran with up to now. She sees herself as, she sees that her skin color is brown, but that's not how she identifies herself. She doesn't reduce herself to a skin color. She's Kezia, she's Zimbabwean. She will tell you a lot of things about her. So when you ask her who she is, she does not reduce herself to a skin color, especially a skin color that doesn't make sense, that doesn't match who she is.
When in Zimbabwe, was their language, was the race language that people in Canada and the US associate with race anyways, namely in the terms of white and Black? Did that language exist there? I mean, was there, and what did it mean, if anything?
I look at it from the perspective that the Euro-American people who were in Zimbabwe were really the minority. So it was used in the terms of a description, that when you're describing a person, you're like, oh, we have this white person who works here. And I really didn't put so much thought into it, because because I was operating from the perspective of being the majority. So we really didn't, it wasn't in my books that I read. We didn't talk about racism or anything like that. So it was there. And for the most part, I think there was more colorism than anything. You see there were skin lightening creams, people who were bleaching their skin and what have you. And I mean, at that age, I was too young to understand what that was. And even perming my hair, I did perm my hair and straighten my hair up until I came to Canada. That's when I stopped. So there were some what I like to see is perhaps effects of colonialism and to some degree maybe racism, but I see the bigger picture as really being your colonizer. You people where you emulate what the majority is or at that point and what have you. So the colorism was really loud and clear. We even had nicknames for people that were light skinned, and it was associated with beauty and being attractive and all of that. So the message was really embedded in everything, but it wasn't one of those things that I can say it stopped me from achieving anything, or I think about it every day, or it stopped me from this and that, but it was there for sure.
I've spoken with a few people from Nigeria, and they've told me how in Nigeria, the languages there are Black, white, but that white was really designated for anyone who was coming from over the seas to Africa. So any American who would be racialized as Black coming to Nigeria under their system would be white. And that's alarming and surprising to a lot of my students and a lot of people I talk with, because that's just not how they conceptualize the language that we associate with race or what race is. And to some extent, I've learned from my Nigerian friends that they really view their society as being, they view themselves as having a pretty raceless conception of themselves, in that even though there's a designation of what it is to be white, right, it's as simple as saying it's anyone who has to, cross an ocean to get to Nigeria, right. Which strikes me that that's it has a very different meaning than what it means in a place like the US or Canada, which I have a very limited understanding or knowledge of, admittedly. Right. But in the US, to be racialized as white, and this is where I feel like there's a bit of a gap that I hope to close the more I talk with people publicly about this, but it's easy to translate race in the associated language into being about skin color. But because racism often hides its face as race in the associated language in the US, what a lot of people are really pointing to, and this is why the emphasis becomes so strong and important to people, is the racism that's attached to race ideology, because racism creates our belief in race, it creates a conception of race and a hierarchy from its inception or conception. It's all built in, so that I find that when people are asserting I'm Black and I'm proud, or whatever, mantra we could sort of put in there, it's not because the Black is partly because of how a person presents physically, right? It's partly because of skin color. It's also because of ancestry. It's part of that. That's part of how a person is determined to be Black or anything else. But it's also an assertion of, I recognize that as an individual, I don't have a say-so in terms of what society does to me. So the racism that I perceive myself as experiencing in any society is an external thing that I don't have control over, because I'm just moving in the world. I'm born how I'm born. I look how I look, and my parents are who they are. So the racism, it happens to me from an external, place. And that racism is what I'm really pointing to when I say, I want you to see my Blackness, or I want you to see that I'm Black, or I am Black, or you're Black, right? Because people will look at me all day and they'll be thinking about racism and they'll tell me how Black I am, right? It doesn't matter that you embrace your racelessness, because America sees you as Black and racism is a thing. So something I'm thinking through increasingly is that gap in really understanding what people are calling attention to when they underline and underscore and emphasize race in the associated language. And as I talk about in my book, which you were gracious enough to do a review for, it is really the conflation of race with racism itself, with culture, with ethnicity, with social and economic class that keeps us so tripped up. And what I would hope is that more people would start talking about that in its complexity, instead of reducing what's happening to it's just about skin color, because that's not really what it's about in the public sphere if you analyze society and how these things are happening. Because I think it also lends to the kinds of obstacles that you and I will inevitably face when we're trying to have conversations with people, when we're educating people, and when we're hoping to help people see themselves outside of racism or racialist ideology. That becomes infinitely harder because there is a sort of disconnect between what a person thinks race is, between what every person thinks race is. And it's almost not even enough to say, well, almost everyone or every country has a different idea of what it is, and so therefore it should just be thrown away. We have to tend to the fact that a lot of people put significance there for all of the reasons I'm explaining. And so to them, it's not just skin color, even if they talk about it in terms of skin color. And then what you're talking about with the skin bleaching and stuff, I was just talking with one of my classes about this because one of my students shared a TikTok, and it was of this young lady who showed her transition. She had, beautiful darker brown skin, and by the end of it, she did it. Probably was fairer than I am. And on the TikTok, she says that she did it because of liver spots. And I was kind of questioning, firstly, who am I to question anyone else, right? What people want to do with themselves, if it's cosmetic, if it's plastic surgery, I'm a big proponent for people who should feel empowered and free to do what they will with their own bodies, right? And but then somehow when it comes to skin bleaching, I feel like that's an entirely different situation, because as you said, there's something about racism that's underlying that. This idea, we can call it colorism, but I tend to just call it racism. There's this idea that to have lighter skin is to be more beautiful, or to be more valuable, or to have more upward mobility. In the US, when people pass as white, it's inevitably because they recognize that there's more economic mobility. And so then it's like, what do we do with that? And how can we really get to the core of what's causing those kinds of belief systems? And I think that's what you and I, and that's why we are like kindred spirits too, is like you and I were really passionate about helping people get to the core of whatever their belief about race is, and however they see themselves through the lens of racialist ideology, to help people free themselves. Because my understanding of the work that you do, you work with a fair amount of racialized Black people. And I work with anyone and everyone, but my work came from my deep and sincere care for people who are racialized as Black, and my desire to understand intra-group problems and fractures, and to, more importantly, find solutions to those problems. So, and I think people miss about my theory that it offers a solution to people racialized as Black, because as much as we look at it as an external thing that people do to me, that doesn't change the fact that each of us on an individual level is impacted by that system, which I'm hearing through everything that you said. I'm hearing that that's true. Even in Zimbabwe, it's like, even on an individual level, people are negatively impacted by the racist ideology that has infiltrated different spaces. And we don't have to just accept it, as you said, and we don't have to suffer, and we don't have to and we don't have to embrace it as a form of resistance. We can reject it, and in rejecting it, we can free ourselves from a lot of misplaced feelings in some ways.
Right. I think there's a confusion with people. The moment you say something is Black center, you're centering Black people or racialized people, there's an assumption that's who you serve. Interestingly, the majority of my caseload is really not Black. It's everybody else. So I wanted to clarify that I work with everyone. I just center the people who are racialized for that reason, that I have seen the need for working with someone who understands the complexities, the nuances, the layers that come with that. But otherwise, I just really work with everybody. And it's interesting when you talk about the resistance. So when you say Black is beautiful, Black this and Black that, I've come to understand that obviously as that discourse of resistance. But there's also that assumption that if I say I'm not Black, which is what I really say in most cases, there's an assumption that it's an identity crisis. I don't know who I am. I have internalized anti-Black racism or whatever. We have these assumptions that people should be this or that. And I think the moment we put people into binaries, we perpetuate the same things that we are claiming to dismantle or to fight against, to abolish, really. So it's really understanding that people are complex. It's even this racelessness walk is not linear. It's going to come with stages, from a time that you may find yourself resisting. And then at some point, as you understand, we expect people to have those paradigm shifts, that you understand that sometimes even in the context of me trying to resist, I may be perpetuating the same thing that I'm trying to challenge. So we can't really change something that we are complicit in. We can't say race is a lie, but I'm still Black and people are still white. It's like walking backward and forward at the same time, but expecting to reach your destination at whatever time you're supposed to be there. And it doesn't really work that way, I think. So yeah.
Amen. It's you and I were talking before we went live about the layers of this, because it is complicated. In some ways, it's so logical that it seems very, very, very straightforward. But it's like the more you learn, the more you venture down the path yourself, the more complicated it presents. And I'm thinking about how, firstly, I would say you're one of few people that I've seen talk about racialized white people as people who are racialized, which I think is really important. And I wanted to emphasize and highlight that, because they are also racialized. And I think so long as we continue to miss that fact, then it's again this paradox of unintentionally upholding the same thing that many of us say that we want to resist or indeed destroy. And so I hope more people can hear you say that and not just hear what they might already believe, which is that only people of color are racialized. So there's that. And also I find that the sort of what I call racialist ideology, one aspect of it that I think too many people miss, and truth be told, historically speaking, in the US, it's been politicized, which encourages it to be misunderstood. It encourages people to misunderstand this. But what you were speaking about with internalized racism, and you're having a sort of being accused of having an anti-Black identity crisis and all of that. So this is something that's persistent, historically speaking, in the US up until now. If you look at American literature and primarily African American literature, then you will come to see that there's this trope of the mixed black and white figure who is generally called mulatto or mulatta. And usually they were tragic, and they were tragic because they didn't fit and they couldn't fit into the quote unquote black and white or white world, right? And oftentimes they were presented with this internal struggle of having to decide, are they going to reject their black identity, or are they and embrace their white identity, or are they going to do the right thing and embrace their black identity, recognizing the fact that that would mean that their lives would be harder. And out of that literature and the sort of fictional landscape of passing and this tragic figure, we come to recognize that people have taken this idea of being mixed, especially when it comes to being mixed with black and white. They've bought into the metaphorical blood, right? There's white blood, there's black blood. They've bought into it, hook, line, and sinker. And there's this belief that how your race is also going to dictate how you think about a thing, which is always interesting, because it's like, how does that work? But then you come to understand it's actually because how you're racialized will inform how you might be treated in any given space. And then that might influence and inform how you think about a thing. But what what society, at least in the US, keeps to miss is that in reducing the race transcenders, as they're often called, to these people who were mixed, or in a study that was done more recently, I think it was a sociologist, I think her name is Amy Rockamore. I know Rockamore is her last name for sure. But in that study, she talks about mixed people or race transgenders. She talks about immigrants, and she talks about racialized white people. And the messaging is where you're born or how you're born racially will dictate your ability to free yourself from the strictures of racism in a lot of ways. And it's super ironic because, you know, you were an immigrant, but even if you were born in a country, as I'm a US citizen, right? I'm an American, people will still hear what I'm saying and try to reduce it to, I don't know any better, I'm being misled, I have lighter skin privilege, so there's that. They'll say I'm mixed. They'll make all kinds of presumptions about who I am and how I am. And instead of engaging with my ideas, and let's not forget the evidence that I'm bringing to the table, it's automatically that whole narrative. And it's dangerous because what gets lost is that also historically up until now, there have been people who are obviously racialized as Black, who have had alternative philosophies of race in every discipline. There's this one guy named Montague Cobb. He was an anthropologist, and he wrote over 1,000 papers on the non-existence of race in nature. Did a whole bunch of lectures, lived almost 100 years. He was prolific, and anthropologists will probably never hear his name. His work is, it's basically hidden in some ways because people aren't interested in hearing from people who look a particular way when it comes to questioning or the status quo. And
what do you call that?
I call it racism. I call it an effect. To be more clear, I call it an effect of racism because it's racist and racialist ideology that would have us believe that if we are racialized in a particular way, we have to think a particular way, or we experience the same thing, or we enjoy the same culture, et cetera, or we're this, you know what I'm saying? Like where it homogenizes and washes over differences and similarities in really harmful ways. And in that way, to be racialized as Black in American society continues to mean that you have to be politically Black, which is understood as being Democrat, right? If you are at all conservative, you are lambasted as being a white supremacist, you hate yourself, you don't know history, you don't know anything, you're wrong. But then even for people like me who, to be told politically, I'm not conservative, I lean left, so then the narrative will just change. It's just that I've been somehow misled, and it's because I'm mixed, and it's because I have lighter skin, and and all of that. And we keep doing it to ourselves. We do it to each other. And it's so pernicious because, as you said, once you can get outside of the fishbowl, it's like you recognize that we're all just, you said, simultaneously walking forward and backwards, which really just means we're standing still or we're moving in place, which is probably worse than standing still. And we have alternatives, we have solutions, but racism prevents us from engaging with those options in meaningful ways, because there's only one way to think Black. There's only one way to be politically Black. Which is the same as saying there's only one way to be Black. Let's be clear. And how racist is that? I mean, come on. It's racism.
In Zimbabwe, mixed people, and I say mixed in quotes, like you, were called colored. So that was the language. That was the racialization language. It was called colored. And then you come here, colored means something different. Yeah.
I think they have the same type of system in South Africa where it's Black, white, and colored. Well, I have to revisit that one. There's this one book I'm thinking of where he did a study and broke down all the different categorizations there. But yeah, it is getting frustrating. I mean, I think it's always been frustrating because even as my own journey has been a long and winding one, and even as recently as 3 years ago, I would have been cognizant of the problem, but still in the trap of conflating everything I love about myself with race and what I'll say is race language, such as Black. And so helping people, one thing that stood out to me about the sort of autobiography that you shared was that you do have your ethnic roots, which is people should not hear she has her Black roots and so therefore she's okay. She has her ethnic roots in Zimbabwe to a particular community of people, to a particular language. And there's a difference. And a lot of the resistance that I hear in the US is around the fact that many racialized Black people here don't have that, right? Because of slavery. And while I recognize and honor and appreciate that fact, and I appreciate and honor the fact that that's how a lot of people feel, I'm also encouraging more people to look at American in a more generative way, because I think part of the desire to always go back to a certain time period and say, those are my people, those are my roots. I think that part of that desire is an effect of racism, both because of slavery, but then also because we're taught we're taught to believe in the fiction of race. And so there has to be our people somewhere back there. It can't be that our people are here. And I think that has an unfortunate effect of creating more harm than good, because it keeps a lot of people feeling like something is missing and something is absent. And I think that technology is such that there's things people can do, right? You can get an ethnicity test and see where your DNA derives, and explore those different cultures that you might otherwise not be privy to. And or you could we could look at American as more reflective of what it is and what it's been all along, despite the fact that we continue to racialize ourselves and other people and what it is to be American. I think there's a deracialization of the concept of what it is to be American that needs to happen that can benefit a lot of people. Do you find in Canada that there are similar tensions or problems happening? Like what do people born in Canada, how can I say this? People born in Canada who would be racialized as Black, is there a term that they call themselves? Do they call themselves Afro-Canadian or African Canadian? Like, what is the language in Canada like?
I think there's similarities, and as far as that is concerned, I think that most kids are sponges, right? They soak in what is given to them. So if you're born into a society that labels you Black, it's very rare that you will question that. So I've seen in my groups where there's that distinction between those that were born elsewhere and those that were born here. So there's that racialization, that embracing the race, the race language, the racialization, the racialized identity seems to be normalized here as well. I've seen just about in as much as those of us that were born elsewhere, there are some of us who reject, and there are some who feel like perhaps there's some advantages to that proximity to identifying with the host society, I guess. So I've seen that too, and it goes back to what you said, that we are not a homogenous group. So there's no one single story that I can say, whoa, those of us that came from somewhere think one way or the other. I've seen a difference. I've seen varied viewpoints, even with some of us that were not born here. But for the most part, I think there's no difference for people that are here. I've had the Afro-Canadian, and then the diasporan for those of us that are still in touch with our native countries or cultures. And then there are those that are on the extreme that really want nothing to do with their native languages or heritage, or even going back, especially for kids that are trying to fit in, depending on what they conceptualize and the meanings that they make from the way that they are treated. Most of them will use that resistance as a way of survival. And I think that's where that internalized hatred, some of it comes from. It's from a perspective of trying to survive and not wanting to be treated differently. I've seen some youth that have committed suicide and things like that, and some immigrants. There's those stories here too, and it usually has to do with when the bullying is racially motivated. So kids will be teased about their skin colors and those derogatory languages, and that have to do with their skin colors. I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked at studies and so forth, but I know that it does exist for sure.
That's an important point, because another misconception I find of some people might have when they hear you and I talking about racelessness or race in these ways is that we're discounting the fact that racism exists and happens, which is the last thing that I'm discounting. And in fact, the theory of racelessness wouldn't even exist if racism also didn't exist.
Right.
And so I want to emphasize that, because it's kind of at first it's a strange thing to recognize racism exists, but race doesn't exist, from my own racial skepticism. Right. And people really struggle to see where I'm coming from with that, which is interesting, because I do feel it is very straightforward. And as you said, there's this sort of tendency to share sentiments such as race doesn't exist, but I'm this race, right?
Right.
and that's because a lot of constructionists about race, so a lot of people who believe that race is socially constructed, they'll say race doesn't exist, but what they really mean to say is race isn't biologically real, but it's real as a socially constructed phenomenon. So and on the one hand, they're saying it's not real biologically, but it's still real in this other way, and it has material effects and consequences. So one aspect that I'm hoping to help more people grapple with and understand that, let's be clear, if we understand the philosophies of race, which admittedly most people don't, that's why I'm teaching about it, and you count yourself as a constructionist, if you say race isn't real, it was created to subjugate a whole bunch of people, then really you'd be better off saying race is real because it was constructed to subjugate a bunch of people. Or explore skepticism, a philosophy of race, a belief about race that is so understudied, definitely untaught, and very often misunderstood where it does pop up because of how racialist ideology tends to work. As Shayla and I have been talking about, it's like this tendency to marginalize and exclude certain philosophies of race across time, because it's easier to just call those things anti-Black, or it's easier to just call those things white supremacists instead of actually engaging with what's being said and the ideas behind it. Let's recover all of that work, because there's been skepticism throughout history about what race is and what it isn't. And skepticism, I think, gets us to eliminativism. That is the belief that race, or our belief in race, should be completely eradicated, thrown in the dustbins of forgotten history, otherwise called as race abolitionism. Skepticism gets us there faster, because if you can understand that racism is real and it creates a fiction of race, and it requires our belief in race in order to continue to persist, then you can understand the practicality of getting rid of it, getting rid of it. And part of the getting rid of, from my own perspective, necessitates the changing of language as it pertains to a person trying to describe ethnicity or a person trying to describe culture. Because like we were talking about earlier, it is this constant assertion of, well, because I don't have connections to whichever country my peoples came from a couple centuries ago, 4 centuries ago, whatever, because I'm disconnected, then Black is the stand-in for that disconnection, right? Okay, but what else is that word doing? Right? Because we have to understand, if nothing else, we just have to understand and be cognizant of the fact that in embracing that word to describe ethnicity or to describe culture, it is attached to race ideology, which means it's attached to racist ideology, which means that we are ironically helping to perpetuate the thing. Right. And is there no other way that we can describe ourselves? Is there no other way outside of racism and historical and contemporary where we can describe ourselves and feel like, okay, nothing is absent if I describe myself in this way? And those are the questions and the sort of quagmires that are on the table for a lot of people. And that's what makes your work really essential, because it's deeply psychological, it's emotional, it's spiritual. I think it's really all of the things, but there are alternatives and there are solutions and there are ways to stop racism in its tracks and not just kick the can down the street and say, well, right now we have to embrace the idea of race in order to talk about racism or highlight it or whatever, and the next generation can get rid of it. No, we can do all of the things at once, and we probably should.
Right. I think people tend to confuse racelessness with colorblindness, and that's where the confusion is. when they hear you say, let's consider the raceless, let's return to being raceless because that's how we are born, they hear something else. They hear color blindness. Yet you're not saying that don't see color. You're saying see beyond color, right? And don't reduce yourself to being a color. Don't reduce yourself to existing as a reaction to something else. Because when you look at it, black does not exist without white, and white, they kind of go hand in hand, right? As a binary. So one sees the self through the other, and the other through sees itself through the other. So as a black person, if you see yourself as black, you are really, I think it was Toni Morrison, that you're living as a reaction to whiteness, which means you don't see yourself as an individual. You're just a juxtaposition to something else. And I think it's important for people to see that, like, who are you if we take away that race, if we take away those colors? I really think it is just a color. So there's a difference, right? We're not saying forget what people look like. And I've heard the argument, what about Sudanese people who are really pitch black? And I want to say that I had never seen people from Sudan, until I came to Canada. But even when you go to Sudan, people from Sudan see themselves as Sudanese. They don't see themselves as black. I mean, I can't speak for them, but I would assume that most people that are in the motherland, they have their ethnicities, their cultural heritage and traditions and tribes to identify themselves by. So I doubt very much that they identify themselves through the color that is imposed on them. I really see it as an imposition more than that's how they are born, that's how they see themselves. So that I've seen that as an argument from people who want to defend racial identities.
Yeah, that's exactly right. People mistake what I'm saying as this is just colorblindness, and some people see that as a positive thing, and some people don't, right? But where it's radically different, and what I find myself repeating is that colorblindness operates under the assumption that race exists, that there's something I can translate about a person, namely skin color, phenotype, into race, and then I cannot let that dictate how I treat you. It's admirable. I will say that it's admirable. But the reason why it falls short of liberation and actually stopping racism in its tracks is it's still operating under the presumed existence of race. And so long as that's attached, it does make it harder not to have biases, because the biases are automatically attached to it. So you cannot, like, you can be a good person, you can treat people how you want to be treated and all of that, but as a nation, if we continue to operate under the presumption that race is real in a meaningful way to divide ourselves from ourselves, then we will continue to reap what we sow. And as you said, walk forward and backwards. I saw a tweet yesterday from a gentleman who was talking about, I think it was some kind of Christian retreat or something, and he was preaching, and he was talking about people advocate for color blindness. He's like, but we don't want to ignore or pretend that colors don't exist, which it's like, yeah, obviously. So he was like, we need to advocate for color blessed. And I was like, oh my goodness. It's like I understand what he's trying to accomplish. I understand what he's saying. I do. I just really look forward and relish in the day and imagining a future when more people stop upholding the mistranslation of skin color into race, and thereby unintentionally upholding the machinery of racism. I really look forward to that day. And speaking with you and increasingly with more and more people, I still have a lot of hope that we can get to that place during our lifetimes. You know, God willing, I'm going to live a very long life. I also wanted to say, when you're talking about, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but something I feel is relevant and sometimes needs to be spoken is that how racialized white people see racialized Black people, and part of the reason I imagine why they would really benefit from working with you or I on this is it can sometimes be very paradoxical, because I have people look me in my face and tell me who I am or how I am as a racialized Black person when they're racialized white people. And sometimes those same people will be accusing me of you know, basically not being Black enough. Like I was in this whole thing on Twitter where somebody was like, oh, I don't want to listen to these Black voices. It was myself and Reverend Starlet Thomas. I listen to the Black voices of the people in my community who tell me X, Y, and Z, and this is how I think about whiteness. And I talk with white people about whiteness. Was a racialized white man telling me all of this on Twitter, and disagreeing with my theory, which he has never heard about, right? Because people mistake my theory with just general ideas about racelessness, and they miss the point that it's a conceptual framework and yada yada yada. So it was like a whole thing, and increasingly, and in a country where statistically speaking, racialized Black people are the minority by a lot, but 13%. Mm-hmm. It is important to recognize the role that racialized white people play in all of this, and the fact that there's an opportunity here for everyone to recognize how, in some way or another, they have participated in upholding and maintaining the whole thing. It's not a blame game. Mm-hmm. Because it's, to my mind, because it's not just any single racialized group. Like it's really the statistical majority of people in countries like Canada and the US, where there's a belief in race, and the belief in race is passed on. It's taught to K through 12. It's taught in university. It's taught through media. It's taught through, families. Every aspect of society, you're taught to believe in the fiction of race. And so it's really, to some extent, it's not even our fault. It makes perfect sense that we are where we are today, right? But then when you meet a Dr. Mason, or when you meet a Shayla, there's an opportunity to open up your mind to the possibility that, hey, maybe we continue to be in this hamster wheel because we've got it wrong. Right. And maybe we've gotten it wrong, not because we're bad people, right? Not because we're evil racists, which it makes me giggle just saying it like that. But because we were taught and we learned, and thereby it was harder for us to just on our own magically see ourselves outside of the thing. But now I've been exposed to a different way of seeing this thing. And you know what? Maybe the best evidence for the fact that how we're doing things now as it pertains to race ideology and anti-racism, maybe the best evidence for how that's impractical and an illogical and irrational way to continue to proceed is because we've been doing that same thing for centuries. Right. That's the best evidence I can point to. We've been doing the same thing for centuries, even though we convince ourselves we're progressing. Right. And so what if we've got it wrong? And what does that mean? And what do I have to do as an individual to free myself from this conceptual framework that I've been taught, that I've inherited? And what benefit does that have to me? And what benefit does it have to my neighbor who is being racialized as well, right? This is it really has to be a national effort, I think, in any nation who's struggling through these types of histories and this ideology. If they're sincere about actually transcending racism and stopping it in its tracks. And we know that people profit off of it. Let's be clear, we've got a ginormous mountain to climb, Shayla. you know, the powers that be, they want race to continue to exist in the minds of its citizens. But if the statistical majority of people stand up and say no more, we've seen how that can change the way a nation does things, and that's what I hope to witness.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really a journey. It is a journey, and it's a collective one. I think Indeed. It goes back to the concepts of Ubuntu, that we are really all interconnected, and which is why I don't advertise that I do anti-racism work. I say I do more of anti-oppressive, because even racism does not exist as a one thing, right? It does intersect with other petals of people's identities and social location. And so yeah, it is really need to be a community effort, and at all levels, because children, we pass on the baton to the young people, and they continue, like you said, we've been doing. If you destroy a house but you keep the same foundation, you're gonna build the same house. So you can't really, even though you will look at it as a new house, it's really not a new house if the roots are the same, if the foundation is the same. And I really think that you put it beautifully when you said we have been doing the same thing again and again, and that's why we get the same results. We come with fancy terms and policies and all the equity, diversity, and inclusion and all that fancy stuff, all the trendy work, but at the end of the day, we are really in that vicious cycle, and we've produced really, there has been some changes. Obviously, we are not in the same page that we were 100 years ago, but fundamentally we are still just going around doing the same thing, racializing ourselves and claiming to be anti-racist and being pro-race at the same time. We're just going around.
Shayla, thank you so much for spending time with me today. It's always a joy to chat with you, and I look forward to many more chats.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who was able to join us during the live. If you're catching this on replay, please sound off in the comment section. Let us know what you think and how you're thinking about anti-racism and racism and racist